Hi, everyone. I'm going to introduce Ken Tao today. And Ken Tao graduated from UC Berkeley with a dual degree in a Bachelor's of Science in Bioengineering and a Bachelor's of Arts in Molecular and Cell Biology. As an undergrad, he received the Jeffrey I. Weiner Memorial Prize, which is awarded to the top graduating senior in the neurobiology emphasis of the molecular and cell biology major. And Ken is currently pursuing his PhD in neuroscience at Harvard. So Ken is one of the most coveted MCAT minds in the nation. He's worked with dozens of undergrad students as a TA and an MCAT tutor for the Princeton Review. Now he's written many books sharing his wealth of knowledge in the MCAT. He has an outstanding rate of student success, and his students often score above 520 on the current MCAT exam. So we're very honored to have Ken Tao with us today to share some more knowledge about them.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. And the topic for today is how to start studying for MCAT as a community college and first and second year undergraduate student. So I just want to note that this is really part two of a talk. So yesterday we had part one, which was providing an overview of what the MCAT exam is. So today I'm not going to go through a lot of those same basics, but if you want that same overview on what the MCAT is about, I would definitely check out that previous talk. And from my understanding, that will be posted on YouTube, so you'll be able to look at that recording. So introduction-wise, I was just introduced, but yes, my name is Ken. I'm the director of MCAT for Med School Coach. Before I came to Med School Coach to start our MCAT program, I was a senior MCAT instructor trainer, and MCAT content developer for the Princeton Review for 5 years. And then I was recruited to Med School Coach to start our MCAT program. And our MCAT program has now been around for about 4 years. So I've had 9 years of experience in the MCAT space, which in other industries doesn't sound like a lot, but within MCAT it's actually quite a lot. So at this point, I've worked with thousands of students and helped them with their MCAT preparation, and really happy to be able to speak with those of you who are here today for this presentation. And I know a lot of you are earlier in your paths towards medicine, so this talk will definitely be focused on the MCAT, but we'll also have some slides where we'll be talking about some things that you might be able to do in your early years. So here's the breakdown for today. We're going to start first by talking about strategies for preparing for each section of the MCAT. I think having this breakdown on why each section of the exam is so difficult and what students can do to succeed on the exam can really provide you with some ideas of how you might want to think about preparing for these exams successfully. The next topic that we're going to go over is how to develop study skills as a community college or first/second year undergraduate student. As I mentioned in yesterday's webinar, I really don't think that students who are just starting their college courses as a first-year student or even a second-year student, or even if you just transferred college, in a lot of those cases, instead of worrying about the MCAT, it makes more sense for you to actually spend more time doing well in your college courses, but that's easier said than done. So I'll talk a little bit about how to develop good study skills early on in college, and help you tremendously with your courses and also with the MCAT later on. And then the last thing I'll mention is this mobile app which we've created here at Med School Coach, which can be a nice way for you to start your MCAT prep. Okay, so we go through this section by section. We're going to start first with the Chem Phys section. You'll recall that the Chem Phys section stands for the Chemical and Physical Foundations of Biological Systems. It is the first section of the exam. It is 95 minutes long and has 59 questions. There are quite a number of reasons why the Chem Phys section is so difficult. And if you ask most students who are studying for the MCAT and you ask them which section they think is the most difficult, it's always one of two sections. One of those sections being Chem Phys and the other section being CARS. So why is the Chem Phys section so difficult? Well, number one, it integrates a broad range of subjects. So here's the subject distribution for the Chem Phys section. It's 30% general chemistry, 25% biochemistry, 25% physics, 15% organic chemistry, and 5% biology. And yes, you can say, okay, yeah, looks like quite a lot of subjects. Well, a question I have for you is, for those of you who have started taking college classes, let's say in your first year, you took general chemistry, and then maybe in the spring or the fall of your sophomore year, you took organic chemistry. my question is, how much of that general chemistry knowledge did you need for organic chemistry? And I would say the response for most students is close to none. Or similarly, if I were to ask you, hey, you took physics and you took first semester physics, which is Newtonian mechanics. If I ask you, hey, how much of that physics did you need for biochemistry or organic chemistry? You probably say 0, right? So that's not how it works for the Chem Phys section. That the way that you've learned the science concepts or the way you're taught the science concepts in university classes is almost to think of these subjects as being discrete and independent of each other. But something that you're going to have to be able to do for the MCAT is integrate all of these subjects together, right? How are all of these subjects related? And in some cases, the application can be pretty straightforward, right? In physics, you might be learning about the physics of fluids, right? So on the MCAT, they might expect you to apply your knowledge of fluid mechanics to blood in the body, right? So combining different subjects. And there's other ways that this can be done in more difficult ways. I'll tell you, for example, perhaps the highest yield topic in all of the Chem Phys section is acid-base chemistry. When most students think of acid-base chemistry, they think, oh, that's a general chemistry concept, right? Acids donate protons in solutions, bases accept protons in solution. But what you have to recognize is that acid-base chemistry crosses over with organic chemistry as well as biochemistry, right? In general chemistry, you learn the foundational principles of acid-base chemistry. What are acids? What are bases? How do I calculate the pH of solutions? In organic chemistry, they're going to apply those same concepts, but with organic molecules. And now the questions that are being asked are, how does the structural features of an organic molecule affect the acidity or basicity of a compound? And then in biochemistry, you have that, but with another step where you're not looking at simple compounds, but you're looking at biological macromolecules, such as proteins. And proteins are made of amino acids, and amino acids are amphoteric molecules that can act as acids and bases. So there's a difference just between how students usually learn these subjects at the college level versus how it's tested on the MCAT. So my recommendation for students is, as you take these classes in college, yes, it's true that it goes semester by semester, but as much as possible, try not to run into this situation where you finish your final exams and you're just like, oh, let me forget everything I just learned, right? You want to try to retain as much of that information as possible. And as you go on to subsequent subjects and courses, you want to try to build upon the knowledge. So think about how the content that you've learned helps you to explain other science concepts in other courses. All right, number 2, why is the Chem Phys section so difficult? There's a luck factor. Now, this doesn't sound great when someone tells you that there's luck involved with your MCAT exam, but there is. The reason being that, I said earlier, the Chem Phys section's got 59 questions. The physics questions encompass 25% of that 59 questions. So that means you can expect about 12 to 13 physics questions in your exam. Well, the thing you have to think about is 12 to 13 questions isn't a lot. And that 25% of physics covers 2 full semesters of physics. So that includes kinematics, forces, work and energy, rotational motion, torque, fluids, electrostatics, circuits, mirrors and lenses, quantum physics, right? There's so much content that is fair game for the MCAT, but won't necessarily show up on your exam. So what tends to happen to students who don't have a full mastery of all the Chem Phys subjects is there's a luck factor. If on their MCAT, it just happens to see physics questions on the physics concepts they understand better, they get a higher score. If instead it's physics questions that they're less familiar with, they get a lower score. So because of that, some students find it difficult to do well in the Chem Phys section because of this variation in the content. So the answer is actually pretty simple. Just make sure you're prepared for anything that the MCAT can throw at you. Number 3, requires a complex set of reasoning skills. I mentioned this yesterday as well, that the MCAT is not like other pre-health exams that are pretty much just memorization. If you memorize those science concepts, you're going to get a good score on those other pre-health exams. The MCAT is a test of application, and you can see this in the specific skills that the AMC says they want to test students on. So those skills are listed here. Knowledge of science concepts and principles. This is pretty much, do you have the content memorized or not? Second is scientific reasoning and problem solving skills. So this becomes a little trickier because this is not just, do you have this fact memorized, but this is very much about application. So they might introduce a new molecule and show you the structure on the exam. And when you see that structure, they're going to be asking you, oh, if I add this other compound, how might they react? All right. So if they're giving you two random molecules you've never seen before, and you're expected to figure out how the two might react together, that's looking at your scientific reasoning, problem solving skills. So next, reasoning about the design and execution of research. So something that you want to start to build as a pre-medical student is, of course, doing well in your college classes, but also getting experiences. When it comes to experience, there's clinical, volunteer, research, and leadership experience. And at this point, what I'm looking at here is research experience. If you don't know, the MCAT, even though it's a test that students have to take to go to medical school and become a physician, the MCAT is not written by medical doctors. In fact, the MCAT is actually written by PhDs. So people who go to graduate school and do a whole bunch of research. So because the MCAT is written by people with PhDs, they like to include experiments and research techniques in those passages. So as a pre-med, you definitely want to get research experience at some point, but if you can start that research experience a little early and start to get familiar with a lot of research concepts, that can also help you a lot with the Chem Phys section. And if you have more specific questions about what kinds of research experience are helpful for the MCAT, we can definitely talk about that later in the Q&A section of today's presentation. And the last part, data-based and statistical reasoning. In a way, this is similar to the last skill, which is understanding research design. But in this case, they're talking about your ability to interpret the results of data that's presented. So the passage on the MCAT might describe an experiment. The scientist did this and that. In figure 1, here are the results. So this is looking at your ability to look at the results and be able to understand what those results mean, and do they answer the scientist's question, and what are those results? Number 4, the last reason why the Chem Phys section can be so difficult, it is the math. So some students just have a tough time with math, right? And unfortunately, when you take the MCAT, you don't get to use a calculator. So there are some basic arithmetic calculations you are required to do. And this is where it's often different from a lot of college courses, that often when you take general chemistry or physics, they'll permit you to use a calculator. So you can do stoichiometry calculations or force calculations. You do need to get used to being able to do simple calculations without a calculator for the MCAT. So try not to become too reliant on a calculator. And it sounds kind of trivial, but there's a lot of students that I've met that have difficulties doing calculations like 50 divided by 0.2, right? So if you think about 50 divided by 0.2, and if you can't figure out in a matter of 10 to 15 seconds that it's 250, then this is an area that you might potentially want to work towards, right? None of the math is particularly difficult, but just some students, the way that they go through their college courses, these basic math skills they learn in elementary, middle school, and high school, they never really practice, and they kind of just forgot how to do math. So some basic math skills is important. And another part of the math are equations and constants. So this can be kind of annoying, but the Chem Phys section does require you to have quite a number of equations and constants memorized for the exam. So at some point, you just have to have them memorized. All right. So now that we've talked a bit about why the MCAT Chem Phys section is so difficult, I want to provide a couple of tips for this section. Tip number 1, practice, practice, practice. I've said this before and I'll say it again. The MCAT is not a test of rote memorization. It is a test of application. So you do want to have a strong foundational content, right? You do want to have a good foundational understanding of the science content tested on the exam, but you also need to learn how to apply your knowledge of science to practice questions. The second point is when you do practice, simulate MCAT testing conditions. So of course, that means you need to do the questions timed. Don't use a calculator. Make sure you're doing practice passages with multiple choice questions, right? Just if you're going to prepare for MCAT, then you need to practice like you're taking the MCAT. And when you practice, you also need to make sure you review your practice questions. Make sure when you get a question wrong, you can review the solutions and understand what you did wrong and what you have to do differently in order to get those types of questions right in the future. And another point I'll make here is devote additional time to your weaknesses. When it comes to studying for the MCAT, at this stage, you've already taken all or at least most of the prerequisite courses for the exam, and you should already know which subjects are you stronger in and which subjects are you weaker in. And that might be, oh, I did really well in general chemistry, but a really tough time with organic chemistry, or I really liked biology, but physics was really tough for me. If you know there are subjects that you are weaker in from your college courses, you need to make sure you put extra time into those subjects during your MCAT preparation. Number 2, commit high yield content to memory. When you study for the MCAT, you do want to keep a running list of physics/chemistry equations in your notebook. I don't mean to do this now for your college courses because your college courses, sometimes they're going to have more equations and constants that you need to know for MCAT, but also at the same time, they don't, right? There's actually a surprising number of universities that allow their students to use a cheat sheet or an equation sheet when they're studying for their exams, right? And it's quite impressive. There are students who will take like these little tiny note cards and write in super tiny font and cram like 10 pages of content on that little flashcard, right? If it's provided to you, great, definitely take advantage of it. But something you should recognize is you're not going to have any sort of equation sheet or cheat sheet when you're studying for the MCAT. So as much as possible, just start memorizing those equations, especially if you know they're going to be important for the MCAT. And if you get into a good habit of this, then it's just a good habit you'll have for the MCAT. That if you think about the students in those chemistry and physics classes where cheat sheets were permitted, if you think about the students who get the highest grades in those classes, are those the students who spend a week trying to cram as much text as they can into a little flashcard? Sometimes maybe, but often not, right? If you understand the content well, if you really understand the content, you've already got the equations and constants memorized. So that flashcard is there if you need it, but it's not something you rely on. So you want to have the same approach for MCAT, just commit high yield content to memory. And it's not just for equations and constants, but especially for biochemistry, your biochemical pathways and your amino acids, right? By the time you take biochemistry, you'll recognize it's often very common that students have to have the 1-letter codes, the 3-letter codes, the structures of the side chains of all 20 amino acids memorized. They also have to have the entire cellular respiration pathway memorized, right? So glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. A lot of this content, if you start memorizing it in your college courses, it makes it easier to do so when you're studying for the MCAT. And another important thing here is also lab techniques. Lab techniques can be a little more difficult because they're often not taught in college courses, or if they are, it's only from really an education point of view, right? So you'll learn, oh, gel electrophoresis separates molecules by size, or Western blot is for proteins, Northern blot for RNA, and Southern blot for DNA. That's often inadequate for MCAT. You do need a deeper understanding of what the lab techniques are for and what they can be used to do. And that's why I said earlier, if you can start getting research experience early on, as even a first or second year pre-medical student, that can be immensely helpful with the MCAT later on. Okay, so this is the ChemTest section. next we're going to talk about the CARS section. The CARS section is also called the critical analysis and reasoning skills section. In this section of the exam, doesn't require any knowledge of science content. So at first you might think, oh, well, that's great. I don't have to study any science content for the CARS section. I can just take it without any preparation. And unfortunately, that's not the case. The CARS section doesn't require any content, but if anything, this actually makes a lot of students underestimate the exam or this section. They think, oh, well, if there's no science content for me to study, there's nothing for me to do to prepare for the CARS section. And that's completely wrong, right? The CARS section is not a section you can ignore simply because there isn't specific science content that is required, right? The CARS section, if it's one of your areas of weaknesses, you definitely need to make sure you have a plan for preparing for CARS. Number two, critical analysis and reasoning skills can be difficult to obtain. You'll be surprised how many students that I speak to get fantastic grades in college. They crush all of their science courses. They're a straight A student, but their critical analysis and reasoning skills are terrible, right? They can do great on the 3 science sections, but they just can't figure out CARS. And often it's just because of how these students set up their path in college, right? In high school, you have to take whatever classes that you have to, right? You're forced to take English, you're forced to take history, you're forced to take science and math. In college, that's not the case. It's in a lot of classes, colleges, they'll require you to take maybe a few humanities requirements, but if you look at a lot of science majors, they'll usually get them out of the way in their first or second years of college, and from there on out, they're only doing science, right? And when you read for science, you have to recognize that's very different from the way that you need to read for the MCAT CARS section, right? For science, you're often trained to read for details, right? Like there are keywords, there are definitions that you're trying to have memorized. That's not how it works for MCAT CARS. If you try to read an MCAT CARS passage and you're just trying to focus on key terms and definitions, it's not going to get you anywhere. For CARS, a lot more of it is about being able to follow the author's argument, being able to understand the author's tone. When the author uses certain words in a sentence, you have to be able to pick up on that, right? I'll give you a simple example. Let's say there are 2 statements, statement A and statement B. And there's one word that I'm going to use here, right? One word, that word is obviously. So it's obviously, comma, statement A, period, statement B, right? So again, obviously, comma, statement A, period, statement B. The question I have for you now is just think between those 2 statements, which one is the author emphasizing? Is the author emphasizing statement A or is the author emphasizing statement B? Right? And you might know the answer, which is good because might mean you understand this well, or you might not, which is common for a lot of students. A lot of students in that particular scenario would tell me, oh, the author must be emphasizing statement A. And unfortunately, that's not correct. And it becomes much easier when I give you an example. So the example would be, obviously, everyone knows recycling is important. Putting recycling practices into good use is far more difficult. So if you just think about how that statement is written, then it becomes clear. It's not the first statement that was important, it was the second statement. And if you take some more time to think about it, if the author chooses to use a word such as obviously, that means the author thinks whatever comes after that word obviously is so obvious to everyone that there's no need to explain it, all right? So it's these kinds of word choices that a lot of pre-med students who are strong in the sciences don't really think about, so they struggle a lot with the CARS section. Number 3, passages cover a variety of disciplines. It's about 50% humanities and 50% social studies. AMC has provided a specific list of disciplines that the passages can be about, and here I've got the full list. And got some topics that students are pretty okay with, right? You have pop culture, you have population health, you have psychology, you have economics, you have a lot, right? Now, for a lot of these topics, they're topics that students aren't used to reading, and it's honestly not a big deal until you get to topics like philosophy or art theory. So when students are reading a passage and the passage is about why music has certain tones to essentially exemplify different moods, or they're talking about buildings and why the buildings have pillars that are shaped this way from this past history, or the pillars might be shaped a different way because of a different kind of artistic influence. There are so many students that their brains basically shut down. They're like, I don't know what I'm reading. It sounds boring, and they just can't read it, right? So this is where, again, a lot of pre-med students who are very strong in the sciences need to be careful. If you go into a science passage and it's about Plato and philosophy and your brain instantly shuts down, it makes it really hard for you to do well in the MCAT cars section. So as pre-med students, there is something that you can do about this, which is read, right? Now, I know that reading is different at different stages of life, right? When you're young, more often than not, you read for fun. Then at some point you get to middle school and reading kind of stops becoming fun for a lot of students, because you're not reading because you want to, but you're reading because it's a homework assignment and you have to write essays on the reading. So it's unfortunate, but as pre-medical students, if all you read are science textbooks, then in many ways, you're going to be missing out on a lot of these critical analysis and reasoning skills. And it's not just your ability to read a passage and figure out what the author's tone, but it's also basic things like vocabulary. The MCAT is not like the SAT or ACT where vocabulary is explicitly tested, right? Where there are flashcards that you can use to memorize different vocabulary terms to answer questions. That's not on the MCAT at all. However, there's a lot of students who, because they don't read very often, their vocabulary is very weak. So they see a word on the MCAT like precocious. And because they don't know what the word precocious means, they just can't answer the question. So my recommendation, as much as possible, you need to make sure you do well in your college courses, but outside of your college courses, try to read on a regular basis. And I don't mean read trivial things as in, I mean, don't read things that aren't going to be particularly helpful, right? But try to read texts with a level of difficulty that's comparable to that of the MCAT. So simple ways that people often say is just read the news, right? Read the news regularly. If you read the news, that can be a good way of just reading regularly. Or better yet would be to read novels, right? So if you read novels, obviously not children's novels, but sort of novels with higher levels of language, that can help you a lot with the car section later on. Okay. Last point, there is a time pressure. So you have 90 minutes to read 9 passages and complete 53 questions. So 9 passages means you have 10 minutes per passage. You have to be able to read at a decent pace. If you're a slow reader, this is where it can get a little tricky. And this is when you have to start thinking a little bit about how you read. There's a lot of students, when they read, they do what is called subvocalization, which is they read with their mouth, right? When you read with your mouth, you have to realize that you're then rate limited by how fast your mouth can move, right? If your mouth can't move faster than the words that you're speaking, you can't read any faster than that. So if you're that kind of student and you know that you're a slow reader, something you can try is read with your eyes and not with your mouth. Your eyes can read far faster than your mouth can speak. So that can be something to think about. You want to be able to increase your reading pace, but not have to sacrifice comprehension at the same time. Okay, so some tips for cars. Cars is like strength training. You have to do some hefty lifting to see any gains. So with cars, it's not something you can cram for. It's the section of all sections of exam that you absolutely cannot cram for. most important is regular cars practice. And before regular cars practice is regular reading. Again, if you're early in your college career, if you're a freshman or sophomore in college, or you're still in community college, get in the practice of reading regularly. That will be really helpful for you later on. Once you get to the point of doing MCAT preparation, do regular passages. And how much practice you need depends on how much help you need. If you're not too far from your target score, it's more so consistency you want. So try to complete a couple passages a day and you should be fine. If cars is a weakness of yours, then you need to do more practice. So do as much practice as you need until you're able to start mastering those car skills. Something else that's also really helpful, and it helps some students, especially when it comes to cars, and that is teach other people, right? So if you're studying with someone else, after you complete a cars passage, try to explain the cars passage to someone else. The reason why this is helpful is because when it comes to studying for the MCAT, a lot of students do this in isolation. They just study by themselves. And when you study by yourself, you often cannot figure out what you're doing wrong. And if you can't figure out what you're doing wrong, that's a huge problem, because how are you going to improve? So when you study with someone else and you try to teach someone something else, try to explain to them what a passage of text is about, it allows you to recognize a bunch of things. Number one, if you can't explain the central thesis of the passage to your friend, that probably means you don't understand the central thesis of the passage. The second thing, of course, is when you go back and forth in this process, when you're explaining a passage, your colleague might say, oh, was that the case? I didn't read it that way. Or I also thought there was this other important point that was being made that perhaps you missed. So if you're able to talk with someone else and explain your reasoning, that can help you a lot. Tip number 2, think about who the author is. A lot of students, I said this before, just can't read certain humanities topics. They just read the text over and over and over again, and nothing sinks in. So something you want to think about is each passage of text in the MCAT was written by an author. And I can guarantee you, none of these authors have the goal of boring other people, right? So it's not like, oh, my goal is to try to bore as many people in the world, right? Their goal is to write a passage for some specific target audience. So what you can do is, as you read the passage, think about who the author is. What is the goal of the author? Who is their target audience? And what are they trying to convince their target audience of? If you think from that perspective, it allows you to better engage with the author and think about the opinions and claims that are being made with the passage text. And I said this earlier, but when it comes to reading MCAT cars passages, paying attention to specific words is extremely important. And that's just because there's so many ways that an author can choose to make a statement, and their word choice is immensely helpful in figuring out what is their position, what is their stance on a particular topic. So words like undoubtedly, surely, especially, all point out what is the author's opinion towards a particular idea. So all of this really helpful. So try to think about this before it's too late. And too late is for a lot of students where they don't recognize these ideas. They've already started the MCAT prep, the week in cars, and at some point it's just too late for them to make the improvements they need. So think about this early on so you can improve as needed. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the MCAT BioChem section and why this section is so difficult. The first point is similar to the ChemPhys section. It covers a broad range of topics: biology, biochemistry, general chemistry, organic chemistry. There's the same challenge we discussed before, which is you have to integrate these different topics together. You can't think of them as being all separate. We have to think about how they're connected together. The second point is similar to ChemPhys. It requires the same set of complex reasoning skills as the ChemPhys section. And a third reason that makes it particularly difficult is very similar to the ChemPhys as well, but is actually even more difficult for the BioChem section, in that there tends to be a lot of complex research passages. So these complex research passages might sound something like this. The scientist first isolates HeLa cells from the flask. They add in a lysis buffer, collect the cell lysate. They took the cell lysate and used density gradient centrifugation to isolate the proteins. Using the proteins, they heated them and mixed them with sodium dodecyl sulfate and then ran them through a gel. From the gel, they applied a primary antibody against tubulin and MCAC, and then they added secondary antibodies for visualization. So if what I said to you just now is gibberish, it pretty much means you're lacking research experience. So these complex research passages can have quite a lot of scientific jargon. So if you can get more exposure with research techniques and research language, that can help you a lot with the BioChem section. And in fact, that's actually the first tip that I have for the BioChem section. And this also is just a good tip for those of you who are looking to get research experience. Something you have to realize in research is when I look at a lot of undergraduate students in research labs, I will tell you that 95% of those undergrads are not actually doing research. They're just technicians. They're doing manual labor, right? If you're just there in the lab playing with mice, cutting brain sections, pipetting solutions here and there, you're not doing research. You're just a technician, right? And that's what you really want to avoid in research. You're not there to do manual labor. Anyone can do the manual labor. You're there to think about the science, right? So you really need to be able to understand what exactly are you doing? When you're pipetting, what are these different components that you're mixing together? What is the purpose of each component? If you're missing any one of these components in your solution, what's the consequence of that? When you run a gel, when you do immunostaining, when you do some experiment, when your results do not turn out the right way, you need to be able to think, what went wrong, right? Can you use science to explain what went wrong? And if you're not sure, can you figure out what control experiments can you run in parallel in your next run to figure out what the issue is? And that's just the first step. That first step is understanding the experiments you're performing, what exactly you're doing. The next part, and this is where a lot of students don't do this, is think about the scientific questions. Like, yes, you might be doing a Western blot, you might be doing ELISA, you might be doing co-IP, but why are you doing these techniques? What is the sample that's being tested? What is the scientific question that you want to answer by performing these techniques, right? These kinds of reasoning when you do research is often lacking in pre-med students who are working in labs. So, if you want to avoid the situation of, oh, I'm working in a lab just to get research experience, as long as I, am here for my 2 hours each day pipetting solutions, I've got that research box checked on my medical school application, right? Try to avoid that reasoning. And in many cases, if you're working in a research lab, you're going to be assigned to a grad student or a postdoc. It is so easy for you to ask that grad student or postdoc questions like, hey, I was wondering, can you send me some papers or journal articles on the work that we're doing? I'd really like to learn more about the work that I'm involved in. They would love to do that. They will send you a whole bunch of journal articles, more articles than you want or can read. But that's the next thing that you need to be able to do. Read those journal articles. Can you understand what is the background? What is known? What is unknown? And once you have an understanding of what's known and unknown, what are the lab techniques that are being used? And take a look at the results. What are the results they obtain? And what are the conclusions that I can draw? And Jubin actually just sent me a message right now, which is actually a great idea. This occurs often in labs, which is they're doing research, but they'll often do what is called journal club, where they'll meet once a week to read over a journal article. I know a lot of what I'm talking about is in a lab setting, but there's no reason why you need to be in a lab to do a journal club. You can simply find a group of friends and decide, okay, every Friday at 10 a.m., we are going to meet for journal club. And each week that we have journal club, there's going to be an article that one member of the journal club picks to present. And everyone needs to read that journal article, and one person is presenting that article. So if you do that on a weekly basis, you're going to be able to gain these skills and really be able to understand how to analyze science and scientific literature that will help you tremendously on the exam. And other things too, when you're reading passages, there's ways you're going to be able to find ways to be able to better understand them. So sometimes it's not just looking at everything as a text, but sometimes you need a whiteboard, sometimes you need papers to be able to draw out pathways for better visualization and understanding of the science. Tip number 2, study using high yield strategies. So when you're studying for the BioChem section, there's a lot of content that you need to learn and review. And you also need to be able to synthesize them together. When you put together a study schedule, you don't want to just keep moving forward. If you just keep reviewing and learning new science content, it can potentially get you in trouble where you forget some of the previous science content that you've learned. So when you build your study schedule, you want to build in time to review those previous concepts that you've learned. And in doing so, it's going to help you memorize those concepts for the exam. And for certain concepts where it makes more sense to do this, create concept maps, Venn diagrams, or other ways to visualize the concepts, right? A very good example are the biochemical pathways. If you make a study guide on the biochemical pathways, that is just a wall of text, that's not going to be very helpful. What helps you far more is drawing out the entire pathway, right? You have molecule by molecule by molecule, and you might have enzymes in one colors, molecules in another, other colors, side pathways in other colors. There's a lot that you can do to create notes and diagrams that can be much more helpful than what the average student does. And I said this earlier, but if you want to test how well you understand the science or anything, try explaining it to a friend, try explaining it to someone else, because if you cannot explain a science concept or any concept to someone else, it means that you don't truly understand it. All right, let's BioChem. Last section, Psychosuction. Why is the MCAT Psychosuction so difficult? Well, number one, it's got a lot of vocabulary terms and names that need to be memorized. For a lot of students, they like to think of the Psychosuction as being the easiest section of the exam. In some ways, it is the easiest section of the exam because there's not a lot of reasoning skills that are required. It's mostly a lot of memorization, but that can be kind of essentially the kryptonite for a lot of students who they're really good at understanding concepts, but they are terrible when it comes to memorization, right? So there is a lot of memorization you need to be able to do for the Psychosuction. And another reason that makes the Psychosuction difficult is it's on the newest section of the exam. Because it's the newest section of the exam, the test prep experts like myself and those who write MCAT Psychosuction books know the least about this section compared to other books. So while you use MCAT books from the test prep companies, the natural science books on chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry are generally pretty good. But sometimes the psychosocial books can be lacking a bit just because we don't know as much about this newest section of the exam as the other sections. Number 3, research focused passage. You should see this as a trend now. All 3 science sections have a big focus on research. Reason number 4, exam fatigue. This is the 4th section of the MCAT. You've already at this point completed 4 hours and 40 minutes of test taking, 5 hours and a half, including the breaks. This is the final stretch. This is the last 95 minutes of test taking. And so many students, they finish early. They finish in 45 minutes. They're not using half of the time they have, and that's just because they are mentally tired and they just want to be done. Ideally, you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. And here's the subject and skills distribution, lots of psychology, good amount of sociology, and the same skills tested as the other science sections of the exam. So some tips. Number 1, address content issues early on. The Psychosuction section is a lot of memorization compared to other science sections. you need to complete a thorough content review. You need to have a lot of the psychosocial content memorized. So make sure you do so. And something that's a little bit different is in the other subjects like chemistry and physics and biology, there's not a lot of crossover, right? Most of the topics are pretty much independent from each other, right? Ideal gases is very different from kinetics, and kinetics is very different from thermodynamics, and thermodynamics is very different from acid-base chemistry or electrochemistry. That's not the case for psychosocial. When it comes to psychology and sociology, there are a lot of different theories that psychologists and sociologists developed to try to explain the world. And when they provide their explanations of the world, sometimes their explanations can have similarities. After all, they're trying to describe the same observations that you see in day-to-day life. So when you're focusing on the psychosocial content, if there are some terms that you feel like are very similar, you need to review those more in depth to make sure you can clearly distinguish those terms and concepts. Tip number 2, read and read again. I said this earlier, many of the terms for memorization are similar, so you need to be really careful. And reading and reading again can be extremely helpful, right? Never hurts to double check. Did I actually read the term correctly, right? Are they asking me about escape learning, or are they asking me about avoidance learning? These two terms in operant conditioning sound very similar. Do I actually understand the difference between those terms? And another point I've also said earlier, which is a lot of students tend to finish the psychosocial section early. We have to realize this is your MCAT. This is going to give you a score that may very much decide whether or not you get into medical school. If you have extra time on the exam, you should do your best to fully utilize that time. All right, so hopefully that provides a bit of background on each section of the MCAT exam and how each section be challenging and how you can try to do your best to do well in these sections. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk more about how to develop good study skills as a community college or first or second year undergraduate student. And again, I'm going to emphasize this, which is if you have any questions that you have about anything that I've said so far, or just have questions that you think of, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section. I'll be happy to answer them later. So the first thing as a community college or first or second year student is coursework planning. And here are just a few tips that I would provide. Number 1, don't take on additional majors or minors because you want to stand out or impress medical school admissions committees. We had a question about this, and I talked a bit about easier majors versus harder majors, right? Like, I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's very common for a lot of students to want to double major, to want to triple majors, or to want to be a double majors and pick up 2 minors. Right? I'll admit this myself, like I did the same thing, and it's not like it benefits you, right? When it comes to applying to medical school, they don't care what your major is or how many majors you have or how many minors you have. All they care about is your overall GPA. And you know what the consequence of taking additional majors and minors are? It means that you have to take more classes. So yes, I did go through 2 majors, and yes, Juven's commenting how I got 2 different undergraduate degrees. Well, that was also meaning that I took on average 20 to 21 units every semester of college, and it's rather painful, right? If you take on more majors and more minors, it just means you have to take more classes, and taking more classes means it's harder for you to maintain a high GPA. So my recommendation, just stick with a single major. Taking more classes honestly doesn't help you. And something else that can be really nice, most majors at universities don't have to take 4 years. Most majors at universities can be completed in 3 years, right? Think about it. If there are students who can complete 2 majors in 4 years, you can definitely complete a single major in 3 years. And if you complete college in 3 years or less, you've just saved a whole year of college tuition. And you can use that entire year to start medical school early or work full time to earn more income or get even more clinical volunteer research and leadership experience. So taking extra classes because you want to impress others is honestly not worth it. Number two, plan out your course schedule in advance. This can actually be really helpful because when you're trying to do well in your college courses, sometimes it's about studying hard, being a good student, but sometimes it's also being strategic. At a lot of college institutions, it's not always the same professor that teaches each class. So sometimes it's Professor A who teaches this class in the fall and Professor B who teaches this class in the spring. Well, I mean, as much as the university would like to claim this is the case, that Professor A and B are just equally good at teaching, that honestly is not the case. And it's also not the case that they have similar grade distributions. I remember that, when I was an undergrad and taking classes, you could look at the grade distributions of classes from different professors and you can see, oh, if you took general chemistry in the fall with Professor A, 15% of the students got A's. Whereas if you took general chemistry with Professor B in the spring, 25% of students got A's, right? So not to say that that should be your specific goal, try to figure out what are the easiest classes, but sometimes you can be a little strategic with planning out your courses to have the best experience possible and the best chance of getting good grades. Point number three, research different classes and professors. I guess this is pretty much what I was saying, but in addition to researching different professors, look into classes more. So if you're looking at classes, it can often be helpful to ask peers, or at some schools, they have websites where they show grade distributions, right? So it differs from school to school, but a lot of schools, when you're looking up classes, you can type in the name of the class and you can see what was the grade distribution in that class, right? But other research, you're just asking your peers, like, hey, I'm thinking about these two classes. It's microbiology versus immunology. These are my elective courses. If you ask your friends, hey, how are these two classes? They might tell you, oh, don't take microbiology. That class was really hard and the professor will make it really difficult. Take immunology instead, right? I know you want to take classes you're interested in. This is college. You're supposed to want to explore. But if you want to go to medicine, what's better is to be efficient and optimize and craft the easiest and smoothest path for you to do well. And you have to realize it's not just about getting a better grade, but if there are classes that you can take that require less of your time on a weekly basis, that's more time that you can spend on other activities to improve your competitiveness as a medical school applicant. And tip number 4, don't pack too many difficult courses together. There are a lot of pre-meds who, I don't know, they seem to want to show off. They say, oh, this semester I'm taking general chemistry with physics with biology. I have 3 hard science courses and I have 3 lab classes. So I have 3 4-hour labs per week. And they say that as if they want to impress other students. Well, the honest truth is that that student's just going to be miserable for that semester and is going to have a really tough time maintaining a high GPA. So if you want to be strategic, there's no reason why you need to squeeze in so many difficult courses in a single semester or quarter. For a lot of students, you can get away with 2 science courses each semester or quarter. And then that 3rd class or 4th class, if you really want to push it, can be easier classes that sometimes are called GPA boosters. You take them simply to boost up your GPA. Okay, number 2, how to prepare for exams. Number 1, learn to use a study calendar. Some of these things it's almost like pre-med students need professional development. And this is not just with calendars, but it also includes things like emails. Some students are just terrible with checking their emails and responding to emails. You need to get better at this at some point. So if you're a student who doesn't use email and all you do is text, you need to learn how to use an email, because at least for now, this is how the professional world, and I don't see any society, at least within the next 5 years, who is, going to start switching to texting instead of emails for important communication. In terms of a calendar, there's a lot of different calendars. Personally, I love Google Calendar because I have a Gmail account, and Google Calendar is fantastic. You can put everything that you need to do, all of your responsibilities, including your exams, on your calendar at the start of each semester and quarter. And these days, pretty much everyone has a mobile device. So your calendar should be able to sync on your phone. So you should always be able to pick up your phone and see, oh, what do I have to do today? What do I have coming up this week? And if you learn to use a calendar and you map out your exams at the start of each semester/quarter, you should be able to figure out which weeks are going to be your toughest weeks of the semester or quarter. And if you know, okay, this is going to be a tough week, and I have 3 midterms all in the same week, then you plan accordingly. You make sure the week before that is a light week. You're not going to commit to participating in a bunch of club activities that week, right? You need to step back so that way you have a lot of exams that week and you need time to study for those exams. And planning ahead with a study calendar, super, super helpful. Number 2, obtain all the study materials that you need to succeed in the class. And notice that I said that you need to succeed in the class. I don't mean just obtain all the study materials, right? We know these days the schools and really the bookstores are quite good. They're businesses, like they're trying to get as much money out of students as possible. So there are textbooks that are $200 or $300. You use them for a semester and that's it. And they'll tell you, hey, we'll buy it back from you for $25. And you're like, wow, it's such a good deal. But really it's not. But when it comes to purchasing study materials, if it's something you need for the course, you really should purchase it. So there's sometimes where you don't need the textbook and you can do fine in class. Sure, that's fine. But there are some cases where you do need the book, especially if you're taking the class with a professor who's not particularly good at teaching. If you're not going to learn from lecture, you need to learn elsewhere. And that can certainly be from the textbook that is assigned. And in most college courses, there's a syllabus, there's a textbook that they're following along, and they describe for each lectures what are the sections in the books that are being covered. And when you have those books, so many students, they have this idea of, oh, my primary way is learning from class, right? I'm paying for college. Because I'm paying for college, my professor should teach me all of the science content that I need to do well in the class. Unfortunately, that's just not the case, right? If you happen to take classes with brilliant professors, great, that's the case. But there's too many scenarios where the professor just is not as experienced with teaching classes, or teaching is not their priority, in which case you need to find alternative methods to learn the content that you need. It's something that I will tell you is immensely helpful is do the reading before going to class, right? I know for some reason, pre-med students hate reading. I said this was the case for the MCAT. So many students just can't read. So a lot of students have a tough time doing this for your college classes as well. But you have to realize textbooks were written to be able to read and understand independently. You should be able to read a textbook and understand the science concepts without going to lecture. So if you do the reading before you go to class, the class will make a whole lot more sense than if you go to class completely unprepared. And of course, be a good student, go to class and pay attention. It is so common, so common and unfortunate at universities for students to sleep in and skip classes. Or they say, oh, I'm going to go work in the lab, so I'm going to skip class, right? As much as possible, don't do this. If you skip class, that only makes your life harder, right? So be a good student, go to class, pay attention, and consistency is important. There's so many cases, right, where I see students where, okay, last semester didn't go well. I'm going to start off this semester on the right foot. I am going to go to class on time every day. And then 2 weeks pass and they start skipping class again, right? sometimes it's not that hard to do well in your college classes. You just need to be a good student. You need to study and you need to pay attention. And often that works. Another source is to go to office hours or find and utilize other sources of help. This is not something that you have to do if you're doing fine in the course, but this is something you should do if you're struggling. You shouldn't just think, oh, I bombed that exam. Let me just keep doing what I'm doing because chances are you're going to bomb the next exam. If you are struggling in the class, if you just failed a quiz, if you just bombed a midterm exam, you need to look for help. If it's a pride issue, forget your pride, right? Just whatever you need to look for help so you can understand the concepts that are being tested in the class and look for help, just look for help. That can help a lot. And office hours can be helpful sometimes. Sometimes professors aren't that helpful in office hours. Sometimes teaching assistants or graduate student instructors aren't that helpful in office hours. But there's often other resources that you can turn to. So at most universities, they have a study center, and the study center will have tutors who are paid by the university to help students who are struggling in their classes. So look for help and get help if you need. And the last tip I'll give is possibly the most helpful one of all, and that is use previous exams as practice. For those of you who join some pre-med organization, at some point you'll find out part of the reason why a lot of these pre-med organizations like pre-med fraternities and sororities, why they can get such good grades is because they have such an extensive database of midterm and final exams from previous semesters. Sometimes these exam banks will span decades, all right? And that can be really helpful because sometimes a professor who's teaching a class, maybe, oh, they're going to teach in spring 2022, but the last time they taught was in spring 2019 and fall 2017. So yes, it's a long time ago, but when it comes to professors are often busy. And I'm not going to say they're lazy, but what professors tend to do is they tend to reuse questions from previous exams. Or if they don't use the exact questions, they reuse the question formats. So if you can get some previous practice exams, and these days, a lot of college professors will actually post on their online course websites or the web pages, they'll post previous exams for you to practice. So absolutely use those previous exams because they'll help you a ton with exams you're going to take from that professor. All right, next, develop a study approach. You need to figure out what works for you. There isn't one way to study for college courses. So you can see here, some students like to study in groups and some students do better with independent study. I've spoken with all kinds of students. Some students, for some reason, they need interaction with other people. They just can't study by themselves. Other students are perfectly fine studying by themselves. And if they're studying with other people, they find them to be distracting and it doesn't work out, right? You have to figure out what works for you. Sometimes it's trying different strategies and approaches, but when it comes to being a pre-med and studying for your classes, you have to realize you have a limited amount of time. If you are good at studying independently and one of your classmates or friends asks you to study together because they're having a tough time with the course, well, yes, by all means, if you have the time to help them, great. But if you really need that time because you're behind in the class yourself and you know that friend or classmate of yours is going to screw around for most of your study session, then it might be better to say no and do what you need to study well. Other things you have to think about are study environments. So in college, there's a lot of students who like to live in the library. They'll be in the library for a bunch of hours, and that's the only way they can study. They can't study at home. If they're at home, the bed's right by them, and they're just going to go lie in the bed and sleep, right? If you need to be in a library, if you need to be in a cafe to study, do that, right? Or if you don't like studying in the library, don't make yourself do that. Whatever it is, figure out what kind of environment that you need in order to study well. And once you have that figured out, just keep doing that for the rest of your college career. And included with this is how you study. So when you start taking college courses, you'll see that a lot of students have different approaches. So some students, when they're watching the class, they just like to pay attention, and that's it. There's other students, as they're in class, they have to take notes, right? Later they make study guides, later they make flashcards. And other students don't like to do that. There's also some students who they can only go to class to learn the content. Other students, they can't do that. Some of these students are the ones who like to take very, very detailed notes. So if they're in the live class, the professor's speaking too fast and they can't take down all of the notes quickly enough. So they prefer to watch a webcast or a recording of that class so they can pause it whenever they need to rewatch certain portions. It's not to say any one of these approaches is right or wrong. You just need to figure out something that works for you. And if you don't figure out what works for you, it can be costly in the form of your grades. So really try your best to figure out the study approach that works best for you early on, and that will help you tremendously. Okay, so last thing I'm going to talk about is this mobile application that MedSchool Coach has created. It is completely free, so you can go on your Apple devices or your Android devices, and on iOS devices, go to the App Store, or on Android devices, go to the Google Play Store, look up MCAT Prep, and you can find this mobile application that we created. And this mobile application has hundreds and hundreds of science videos that cover the highest yield content on the exam. There are also flashcards, practice questions, and lecture notes that are associated with each video to help you reinforce your understanding of the content. It's really helpful for students who aren't quite ready to jump into full-time MCAT studying, but occasionally have free time and want to use that actively for some light studying. So I highly recommend all of you to check out this app because it's really quite a great resource. Okay, so with that, that's pretty much what I had for today's presentation. And as I said earlier, I will be answering questions now. I know I have a couple of questions in the Q&A section, but if you have any questions that you want to ask, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll start going through them now. Okay, first question. In the Chem Phys section, do we need to apply calculus in physics? No, you do not. There is no calculus on the MCAT. You do not need to do any derivatives. You do not need to do any integrals. There is no calculus level math for the Chem Phys section. You have basic arithmetic, you have exponents, you have log math. That's it. And doesn't mean that taking calculus is bad, right? You need to take calculus in order to often take physics, and you need to take math in order to apply to medical school, but you won't have to expect that difficulty of math in your Chem Phys section of MCAT. Next question, do you recommend we take both psychology and sociology courses? So psychology and sociology are actually, as I said earlier, the Psychosuction section is the easiest section of the exam. There are a lot of students who are fine on the Psychosuction section without taking a psychology or sociology course. The reason why is because since these two subjects are so memorization based, if you pick up a psychology and sociology textbook, if you can memorize all of the content in those books, you can be fine, right? So in that case, psychology and sociology is a nice supplement to have, as in if you have the spare time and can take them, I'd say, sure, why not? And going back, remember what I said earlier, which is for a lot of students, when it comes to taking classes, there's no reason for you to take more than 2 hard science courses in one semester, right? Psychology and sociology, tend to be a little easier. So if you want to take chemistry and physics with a semester of psychology and next semester take biology and organic chemistry with sociology, I think that is a perfectly fine approach. Next, do you recommend undergrad students to take 1 or 2 gap years in order to study for MCAT? Would this weaken my med school application? Well, I assume you're not spending a year or 2 gap years to study for the MCAT. It's more so that you're taking gap years as part of your plan to apply to medical school. And it also means that you're looking to take the MCAT perhaps after you graduate, as opposed to in the middle of classes, so you can focus on activities and maintain a high GPA. That is perfectly fine. There are a bunch of students who prefer to wait until they're done with school and graduate before they start studying for the MCAT. There is no issues with that, and there is no way that will weaken your medical school application. Next, how would you recommend we work through our textbooks and in the future MCAT books in order to retain the information? So in terms of how to work through your textbooks, this is what I said earlier. You need to figure out what works for you. Some students, they just have to read the books and the information goes in the brain, and that's all they need. Other students, when they read, they need to read and highlight at the same time before they take anything in their heads. Other students prefer to read and take notes. Any of those approaches is fine. You simply need to figure out what works for you. So if just reading the book by itself doesn't work for you, try highlighting or taking notes. If taking notes takes you way too long and doesn't help you, then try something else, right? Figure out a good study approach in your college courses. And by the time you're ready to take the MCAT, you should already figure out what works for you. So if you figured out that, hey, when I read a textbook, I benefit the most when I take notes at the same time, then you want to use the same exact approach when you are going through your MCAT review books. Next question, how far in advance do you suggest preparing/studying for the MCAT? The average pre-medical student will spend between 3 to 6 months studying for the MCAT. So 3 months is typically for students who are studying full-time for the MCAT, and 6 months is students who are studying part-time. There are some students who like to start their MCAT preparation earlier. My recommendation is, if you want to start your MCAT prep earlier, to start at most 1 year in advance of your test date. 1 year is plenty of time, and I wouldn't go longer than a year for your MCAT prep. If you're more than a year away from your MCAT test date, I would prefer and recommend that you use that time instead to simply focus on doing well in your college courses. Next, do you recommend flashcards as a method of studying for the MCAT? If you have difficulties retaining content over long periods of time, absolutely. And this is where it can be a little difficult for students, because when you take college courses and you take a final exam, the amount of content you have to have memorized is only a semester's worth of content. When it comes to the MCAT, it's 14 semesters worth of content. So while you might think that you are good at memorizing content, you might get to the MCAT and realize you're not as good as you think you are. So it really depends on the student, but it never hurts to use flashcards, all right? The only thing I would recommend is, if you want to use flashcards, don't go to the MCAT subreddit page and download the Ortho 528 and mouse down Anki decks, because if you think that if you download the Ortho 528 deck, you're going to get a 528 as well, I will tell you, you will be sorely disappointed. When it comes to flashcards, you have to realize half the benefit of flashcards is making the flashcards, right? Because when you make flashcards, it requires you to be able to summarize the concepts in a few words. And if you're able to do that, it means that your understanding of the science concepts is quite good. So if you want to use flashcards, make sure you make your own flashcards. And of course, take the time to review those flashcards. So it can be very helpful. Next, how many times might we expect to take the MCAT? My recommendation for how many times you want to take the MCAT is once, right? Take the MCAT once, get a good score, and be done. Who in the world wants to take the MCAT multiple times? It is such a painful exam to study for, right? I tell this to my students all the time. Don't plan for failure, right? Do not plan to fail on the MCAT, because then that means you're planning on taking the MCAT multiple times. Your plan for the MCAT is one and done, right? That is your goal, to take the MCAT once and be done with the MCAT. Now, there are definitely scenarios where students take the MCAT, they don't do as well as they need, and then they need to retake the MCAT. That's perfectly fine, but when it comes to the MCAT, as much as possible, You want to take the MCAT once and you want to be done with it. It is not a scenario where you say, oh, let me take the MCAT once for fun. I just want to see what the MCAT is like. No, that is not what you want to do. Taking the MCAT and getting a bad score is just going to hurt your application, because when you apply to medical school, you cannot hide any of your previous MCAT scores. When you apply to medical schools, they will see all of your MCAT scores. So as much as possible, you want to take the MCAT once and be done. If for some reason you have to retake, that is fine, but the retake is not something that you plan to do. It's something that you had to do because unfortunately you didn't perform as you wanted to on test day. So that's the reason why you're taking the MCAT more than once, not by choice. Okay, next, what is the best time to register for the MCAT? What time of the year should you take it? And how many months in advance do you register for it? Well, in terms of MCAT registration and when you start studying for the MCAT, the two are pretty much independent, right? If you want to take the MCAT in January, you need to figure out how much time do you want to study for the MCAT. If you want to study for the MCAT 6 months in advance, then you need to start studying for the MCAT in July, right? So you're going to start your MCAT preparation in July, the year before January. And I'm going to tell you, in July, test dates for the following year haven't even been released. You can't even register then, right? So when you start studying for the MCAT, it's independent of when registration occurs. It's not like, oh, now I've registered for my MCAT, now I can start studying for my MCAT. No, right? The two are independent. You pick when you want to take the MCAT. Once you have picked when you want to take the MCAT, you figure out when you need to start studying. And then registration, whenever registration opens, you register for the MCAT on the day it opens. For spring test dates, registration typically opens in October of the previous year. And for summer test dates, registration typically opens in February of the same year. So again, the two are separate. You start studying for the MCAT when you need to, and you register for the MCAT on the day that registration opens. All right, so we've gone through our list of questions, but if you have more questions, happy to keep answering them. How long before applying to medical schools do you need to take the MCAT? And they can really be taken very close to each other. So in terms of applying to medical school applications usually opens around May, and students are able to start submitting their applications to medical schools at the end of May or early June. So you can take the MCAT as late as May, right? So you can really have the two side by side, but as much as possible, you want to take the MCAT before you apply to medical school. So it doesn't have to be too far in advance. You know, some students will take the MCAT a year or 2 years in advance before they apply to medical school, but there's no requirement of you have to take the MCAT X amount of days or months before applying to medical school. But you do want to make sure you take the MCAT before you apply to medical school, because medical schools will not review your application without an MCAT score. Next, are there any test prep books you would recommend? So I said this earlier, the set of MCAT books honestly doesn't matter, because there are students who have used every set of MCAT books in existence and have gotten great MCAT scores. There are also students who have used every set of MCAT books that are out there and gotten terrible MCAT scores. So it's not about the set of MCAT books that you use, it's more so how you use those books. But if I had to recommend a set, I would say you can't go wrong with Kaplan or Princeton Review, right? Those are pretty standard sets of books for students to use for their MCAT. In the course section, would you recommend taking courses in each of the subjects or reading textbooks in each of those subjects? Ooh, that's impressive. Well, there's a lot of subjects there, right? The number of humanities and social studies topics, there's at least 20. I wouldn't say to take 20 of those classes simply just for the course section. I also wouldn't take those classes necessarily, just for fun, right? You also have to think sometimes that some of those classes can be hard, right? I know a lot of science students say, oh, humanities classes are so easy, right? And biochemistry and organic chemistry is way harder than any of these humanities classes. Well, I challenge those of you who have those thoughts about how difficult science classes are to go take a philosophy course or go take a literature course and see that those courses are no joke either, right? So I wouldn't take courses blindly just because you want the experience. When it comes to taking classes, if you want to be, the most strategic approach when it comes to taking classes is whatever approach is going to get you the highest grades, right? So I know a lot of pre-med students, some of the courses they took were like African drumming, and they took those classes not because African drumming is going to help them on the MCAT or help them become a physician. They took that course because 90% of students in that course get an A and 10% of students in that class get an A minus, right? So GPA is important. Don't take classes, extra classes just because you want to. The second part that I recommended of reading textbooks in each of those subjects, I wouldn't say to read textbooks, that can be a bit excessive, but I would say reading books on those topics is perfectly fine. And there's actually a lot of books on each of those topics that can be quite interesting, right? So there's so many history books that can be written well. A simple one would be Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? If you want to learn, something at the intersection of history and medicine, that can be a great book to read. If you want to learn about economics, there are similarly really good books you can read. There's a lot of really nice novels you can read on each of those topics where you're able to develop that same level of understanding and appreciation for those topics. So you don't find those topics so boring without necessarily having to take a college course on those topics. Well, the questions on the MCAT are often similar to previous MCAT questions, or how often do they integrate new material? They are extremely similar to previous MCAT questions. That's why I mentioned yesterday, the most valuable MCAT study resources as a student are the AAMC practice materials. And that's because the AAMC are the creators of the MCAT exam, and all of the practice exams that they have released for students to use as practice are from previous administrations of the MCAT.
Ken, I have a question I'd like to ask you.
Of course.
So I was wondering, many community college students once they transfer, they won't have taken biochem. So if they're transferring in between at the end of their second year, they won't have had a chance to take biochem or any upper division science courses and bio courses that might have some more experimental type questions. So for those students, do you recommend them taking it that ideal, summer of sophomore year to apply medical school, or do you think it's a better idea for them to wait an additional year and take it at the end of their third year, which would be their first year at a school, at a transfer school?
So to clarify, I think the summer after your sophomore year is the earliest that any student should consider taking MCAT. I wouldn't say that's when I would recommend students take the MCAT, because it's quite early, and most students haven't covered all of the prerequisite courses for the MCAT by the end of their sophomore year. I actually had a very similar question to this last year, or not last year, but with yesterday's presentation, in terms of when transfer students should think about taking the MCAT. And my recommendation is don't start until you get settled with transferring. There's a lot of students where the transition from community college to the four-year institution can be a bit tough. And the first thing you need to do is, if you've managed to achieve a high GPA with your community college courses, you want to be able to maintain that at the four-year institution. So you don't want, universities to think, oh, the community college classes were easy, so that's why you had a high GPA. And then you go to a four-year institution and your GPA drops by 0.5. So I would say start first by focusing on that first semester and quarter of classes, get situated, make sure you can maintain the same high grades. And once you're confident that you have figured out the transfer institution, then I would say you can start looking at MCAT preparation. Okay, so I see there's another question. Many students didn't do well in organic chemistry and decided to withdraw from the pre-med path. What is your option about this? And I'll say this for Jubin, but there's a poll on the screen. If you can please answer the poll, I think that will be very helpful for this organization whose nice presentations you're attending. So the question again is, many students do poorly in organic chemistry and decide to withdraw from the pre-med path. What is your option about this? The first thing I would say is it's almost like a question. How much do you want to become a physician? If doing poorly in organic chemistry is enough to convince you not to pursue your dream career, I would say, well, maybe you don't want to become a physician that much, and that's probably fine, right? I don't see any reason why, doing poorly or getting an F in a single class like organic chemistry should deter you from becoming a physician. Now, in reality, it happens all the time. The pre-med courses, they're often called weeder courses because there's only a certain percentage of students who can get A's in high grades. So it's very often after a year of pre-med courses that a lot of students change trajectories, and that is perfectly fine. But if medicine is your dream, it doesn't matter how many courses you fail, right? There's a way you can figure it out. There are different paths. It may not be a direct path towards medical school, but there are different paths that you can take. It might mean that after you graduate, if your GPA is not high enough, you may have to go to a special master's programs. You may have to complete a post-bac program, but failing a single class or even a few classes should not be enough to deter you from becoming a physician if that's what you truly want to do. All right, so next, will the Chem Phys problems on MCAT require long multi-step problems, and would you recommend memorizing every single equation for chemistry and physics? So there are two different questions here. So the first one is, does it require multi-step math? You have to realize that you've got about a minute and a half to answer each question on the MCAT, and taking account the amount of time it takes you to read the passages, it's about a minute. The AMC is aware of this too. So no individual MCAT question in the Chem Phys section should take more than 2 to 3 minutes, right? That's the extent of how long an MCAT Chem Phys should take. So if you're solving a problem and it's taking you a long time, it probably means you are using the wrong approach or you need more practice with math. Every single MCAT Chem Phys problem should be solvable within a minute or two. And I can say this confidently because I have gone through every single AMC practice problem that has been released. Next, how likely is it to get a perfect score on the MCAT? Very unlikely. By definition, the MCAT uses percentiles that are associated with each score on the MCAT. So the lowest score on the MCAT is a 472. Hopefully you do not get a 472. I'll also tell you, it's pretty much close to impossible to get a 472. When a student tells me if they get a 472, I tell them that if you were to pick the answer choice A for all of your answer choices on all 4 sections, you're going to get a score greater than 472, right? But going back to percentiles and scores, you have to realize a 521 is already a 99th percentile score, right? So 521 to 528 are all 99th percentile scores. So that means less than 1% of all students get an MCAT score 521 and higher. So now if you want a perfect score 528, that means it's definitely less than 1%, right? So definitely not easy to get a perfect score, but it's definitely happened. At Med School Coach, we actually have a few tutors who have a 528 and several with a 527. So it's possible, but certainly quite uncommon. I'll also say it's not necessary to get into medical school. You don't need a perfect score to get into medical school. As a chemistry major, I didn't take that much biochem courses at UC, which you recommended me to take more bio and biochem courses. For the MCAT, you only need 1 semester biochemistry. So if you took 1 semester biochemistry, that's good enough for the exam. Similarly, for biology, you only need 1 year of general biology. If you have taken 1 year of general biology, that's good enough. For all students, if you've taken more courses, that can help you more, right? So if you're a biology major and you took some upper division biology courses like physiology, genetics, cell biology, those will certainly help you, but they aren't required. And it'll be the same thing. Each student has their own strengths and weaknesses. So if you were a chemistry major, you took more chemistry classes than what was required for the MCAT. So you'll probably be stronger on the chemistry questions on the exam. But if you haven't taken biochemistry, then that's when you would probably want to take biochemistry. But if you've taken biochemistry in a year of general biology, you don't need to take those courses for the MCAT. If you're trying to raise your GPA, for example, to raise your GPA to have a higher chance of getting into medical school, then absolutely you can take those classes to improve your GPA. Next, how are we able to reach those tutors that were mentioned? Would we be able to get help from them? Absolutely, and you can definitely get help from tutors. The only thing I will mention is that test preparation can be expensive and tutoring can be extra expensive. So it is certainly a possibility, but you do have to realize that.
I think she's asking tutors in college, or is she asking tutors for the MCAT?
Well, I can answer both. So if it's tutors for the MCAT, you can find them at test prep companies for a lot of money. If you're looking for tutors at your college, for example, I went to Berkeley. So at Berkeley, we had a student learning center, the SLC, right? So you would just go to the SLC and say, hey, I want to sign up for a study group and I want to work with a tutor, and you'll have it. So at most universities, those learning centers or tutoring centers that the university is paying for, they usually do a pretty good job of advertising themselves to students. So often a lot of those tutors will actually go to classes, and at the start of each semester, they'll say like, hey, just want to introduce myself. I'm a tutor for this class. If you want to join our study group, it occurs on so-and-so day and time. So those you can definitely check out.
Can I also add this? If you are a community college student, the state pays for the tutoring center. And I've done some tutoring in general chemistry and calculus. And I could tell you that I've had a lot of lonely time for students not using those resources and complaining that they were failing. And again, some people just get paid to sit there and are not used. But if you have a MESA center, a tutoring center, learning center, there's a lot of resources at the community college. As a matter of fact, most of the instructors put them in their syllabus or syllabi of where you could find all of these resources at the JC, and so they're very underutilized, to say the least.
I completely agree. There are so many resources that are available to students, and students don't use them, right? I've taught, lab courses as a teaching assistant and also as an adjunct faculty for many semesters. And so often I hold office hours and not a single student goes, which you could say is a problem with myself. But you could also say is students not using the resources that are being offered to them to help them improve in their classes. So any resources you have access to, I would definitely take advantage.
Right. And in your office hours, if a student goes on a tangent for the exam, most instructors will say, oh, well, that's not really going to be too heavily focused. So I think using your resources, I think it's the key factor of both in your classes and your tutoring centers. But I've taken courses where my instructors would say, oh, you don't need to focus too much on this area. It's not going to be on the exam. I just needed to introduce the topic, but it's not going to be tested.
Right, and one other question here for the pre-med science courses, would taking some of them during the 6-week summer session be adequate to comprehend the information and prepare for the MCAT? Absolutely. Doesn't mean it's going to be fun, but absolutely it can be done. So there are a lot of students who take classes over the summer. It can actually be really helpful if you want to get ahead in your courses, or if you want to, try to make your schedule a bit light, right? Like sometimes it's very intense taking a whole semester's worth of content in 6 weeks. That can be really tough, but at the same time, if that's all you're doing for that 6-week period, then you can focus specifically on that class, and it can turn out very well. And another thing I'll say, which I don't know if this is necessarily the best way to say it, but when you are taking a class, and often you're competing with other pre-meds at your school, a lot of academic institutions, when you're taking the class over the summer, those summer courses are open to everyone. So not just students who are at your schools who are trying to get the highest grades. And sometimes if you're taking a class and there are students who are doing study abroad for that summer and taking those classes with you, they usually don't care too much about their grades. So in those cases, it can be a little easier to beat the curve. Not to say that that's always the case, but there's essentially no problem with taking any science course over a 6-week summer session or 8-week summer session or 10 weeks. Just realize it'll be a little bit more intense than normal, but can definitely be done.
And I know we're a little bit over time, which is fine, but I actually had one question before we all head off. I know that every student has their own way of taking notes and stuff, and I've gone through numerous methods of taking notes, but do you think that there's like a very effective way to take notes, or what would you recommend?
Yes, so that's a great question. There are definitely some research studies they've tried to done research on what are the most effective ways of taking notes. And to be honest, I never did a lot of it. I didn't take a lot of notes, and it happened to be okay. But I know that taking notes is helpful for a lot of students. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer as to what is the best way of taking notes, but there are definitely some research studies out there in the field of education who have looked at, different ways you can do outlines, different ways you can do color codings or sections, or how often you review the notes that you take. That can be really helpful. So yeah, I would look into those because I don't have a great answer myself.
Anyone else has any questions before we let Dr. Tao go? All right. Okay. All right. Rachel, you could close us out.
All right, well, I just wanted to remind you guys that if you guys want to get the certificate for the hours that you've completed, all of our quizzes are on our website, so make sure to take those so you can get your certification for your shadowing hours. And I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and Ken, thank you for taking the time to speak with us this weekend. We all really appreciated it. So thank you, everyone. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.